Welcome back, U.S. History, Part 2 of Chapter 28. Okay, we left off with the Marshall Plan yesterday, and just a reminder, the Marshall Plan was basically sending money, 12.4 billion, to Europe to prevent communism. Okay, after World War I, too many countries had financial problems and turned to authoritarian leaders. So we wanted to make sure that communism was not going to sneak in from the Soviet Union. Okay, and I did not make a lot of mention of the National Security Act, so I'll pick up there. The National Security Act in 1947, the Cold War is really heating up, okay? And the National Security Act creates the CIA, in effect, giving the president even more power. We'll see the CIA later on. This is our spying counterintelligence, okay? And again, US Soviet relations going downhill. An event that you'll see in the century, but I'll touch on it here, is the Berlin airlift. Okay, let's not forget that after World War II, Germany was split up by the winners. Okay, Great Britain, France, U.S., and the Soviet Union. So they each got a little chunk to manage, and then the capital itself, Berlin was also split up like this. The city of Berlin was split up into four little pieces, one for the Soviets, one for the US, one for the British, one for the French. Well, the thing is, Great Britain, United States, and France, we are all democratic, so we're all doing things the same way. The Soviet Union is communist, okay? So we're kind of this wall is forming. Not yet, not the Berlin Wall yet, but this invisible wall. And so what ends up happening is by 1948, the US, Great Britain, and France all agree, hey, let's just put our chunk together and be one democratic part. So that's how we got West Germany. All right. But we still had the city of Berlin to contend with. The Soviets are upset about West Germany, so they close off all transportation into Berlin. They don't allow the US or British or anybody into Berlin. So Truman decides, hey, this city is, we don't want to go to war. We just got done with World War II. So he uses bombers to fly in food and supplies daily. I mean, these things are running, look at them all lined up. They're running hundreds of missions a day to bring things. And I believe it was 10 months, and the Soviets finally lifted the gates, and the Berlin airlift was over. NATO and the Twin Shocks. Okay, NATO, I mentioned in the last video, is going to be one of the alliances, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO is going to include the United States. This is a top-down view of the map. So here's Europe over here. So it's going to be Western Europe, United States, and Canada is NATO. And then you're going to have the Soviet Union with the Warsaw Pact. Okay, they're going to create their own alliances. The Twin Shocks. Two things happen in 1949. First of all, the Soviets get the atomic bomb. That means we have no more monopoly on it. We can't be walking around like a cowboy with a gun on his hip because now they've got a gun also, so we lose our leverage. This scares the United States. Anytime the United States gets scared, Cold War tension escalates, Cold War paranoia. And the second thing that happened was Mao won the revolution in China. So now you have the world's largest, most populous country becoming um, communist. Not only that, China is right next door to the Soviet Union, so it reinforces that domino effect that if one country turns to communism, the neighbor will, et cetera, et cetera. So tensions and fear increase. Okay, with that, Truman responds by authorizing the creation of the H bomb. So now what we full on arms race. What I want you to notice here is the parallel to World War One. If you recall from last year, we looked at mania, right? And the four long-term causes was militarism. There's your arms race. Alliances. There's your NATO and your Warsaw Pact. Nationalism and imperialism. Okay, so we're starting to see a lot of these same forces out. Truman also responds with NSC 68, again, driving the fear and paranoia. And we're going to start a lot of a propaganda movement and militarization. Okay, so we have the Japan question. So Japan was defeated in World War II by the U.S. Therefore, the U.S. has the responsibility of rebuilding it. So you could only guess how we're going to rebuild it. We're going to rebuild it democratic with a constitution. Um, let's see here. Okay, Chinese Civil War. Um, I mentioned on the previous page, Mao had won the Civil War. The Civil War in China was Jiang Jieshi, this guy, democratic versus communism. And so you can assume who the United States supported. We supported Jiang Jieshi. Truman realizes we picked a bad horse, and Mao, being more in touch with the peasants who were the poor, he wins that civil war. So that was part of the twin shocks on the previous page. The United States' response to Mao winning the Civil War was basically, you don't exist. Okay? Truman was convinced that the Soviets had helped Mao win. That is not true. Let's see here. Mao actually reaches out to the United States for some diplomacy, for some talks, but we reject with our anti-communism and Truman's uh, tough dealing. We reject chances at talks, which is unfortunate. What that does is it pushes China away from us and closer to the Soviet Union. So they sign an alliance with the Soviet Union. Truman gets blamed for quote unquote losing China. And end result is the United States does not recognize the Republic of China as a legitimate country. Let's see here. Okay, then we have the Vietnam question. This is in preparation for later down the road. The independence leader in Vietnam is Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh had been fighting for independence from the French. During World War II, he actually gets aid from the United States, which makes him believe that the United States would be willing to back him later. The reason why the United States backs Ho Chi Minh then was because Vietnam had been overrun by the Japanese. It had become part of the Japanese Empire. Let's see here. A couple mistakes. When the war, as soon as World War II is over, the rebels in Ho Chi Minh pick up fighting the French for independence. The United States takes a hands-off approach. We don't do anything. We end up sending after a few years, we end up sending money and support to the French. That has to do with the Cold War. Okay, everything the United States does post World War II has to do with the Cold War. I mean, literally everything. So we don't want to help Ho Chi Minh because we need the French to back us. We need the French to stay democratic in Europe. So we don't want to lose an ally. Okay, let's get to the Korean War. The Korean War is going to be very similar to Vietnam in a few more years. Korea had been overrun by the Japanese and taken as a colony in 1910. Okay, well, Japan got defeated. Japan got defeated by the United States in World War II, so the United States took control of the Korean Peninsula, except not all of it. Here's the key part. The Soviets had started coming down. Let me change the color. The Soviets had started, if you recall, the Soviets had promised that they would help us, the United States, defeat the Japanese um, 3 months after the war. And so just before we dropped the atomic bomb, the Soviet Union had begun moving down the Korean peninsula. So they were entrenched there. So post World War II, what we did was we divided up the Korean peninsula and said, okay, Soviet Union, you get to control that half, and United States, you'll control that half. Well, it's no surprise that the Soviet Union fostered a communist government here, and the United States fostered a democratic union here. So the question is what to do with the Korean Peninsula, because the Koreans want to be their own country. They want one united country. And so we have communists trying to unite the country under communism and Democrats trying to unite the country under. So you can see where the war. North Korea invades South Korea in 1950, and the United States, excuse me, the UN votes to defend South Korea. This is where the United States comes in. We're looking through things through a Cold War lens, thinking that, okay, the Soviet Union's up here and they're communist. China just fell to communism. Now North Korea is going to bring communism here. There's that domino effect. So Truman, assuming that Stalin masterminds the attack, says we've got to prevent Korea falling to communism. Korean War began originally as a civil war. Okay, Koreans fighting Koreans, North versus South, but the U.S. starts to back the South. The North Koreans had already been armed by the Soviets. All right. Kim Il Sung wants to invade. He asks Stalin's approval. Stalin's kind of, maybe. Yeah, this is Kim Jong Un's grandfather, right? Truman orders U.S. troops from Japan into South Korea, and his Truman's philosophy is that North Korea will be unified by force. Something interesting and important to note here is that Truman does not ask for congressional approval, which basically expands his executive power. It sets the precedent that he can make decisions about war without Congress's approval. 16 nations from the United Nations forces sent troops, but in the end, they were about 10% of the army. 40% of the soldiers were South Korean, 50% were American, and those American forces were led by Douglas MacArthur, commander of U.S. forces in Korea. All right, so here is Korea, the 38th parallel. This was how it was divided post World War II, and unfortunately, this is how it's divided after the Korean War. North Koreans invade the South, war pops off. The United States under MacArthur does a very daring and successful invasion here at Incheon and is able to push the North Koreans back up towards the border. Now, this is when China starts to get involved because China's seeing what's going on and warns the United States, do not bomb anywhere near here, do not bomb any railroads, etc., etc. And as we encroach and get closer to the border, China decides to act, surprising the United States. China enters the war in 1950 and drives the United States troops and South Korean troops back across the 38th parallel. And then we kind of enter this stalemate here. Okay. The war rages from 1951 all the way until 1953. Mind you, that's only 5 years after World War II. And consequences, the end of the war. Let's see here. It was a dispute over POWs that unfortunately kept this war raging for another extra year or two. In 1953, Stalin dies, Truman gets voted out, and Eisenhower comes in. Remember, I said personalities? Eisenhower got voted in with the expectation that he would end the war, and he does. You can take a look at these statistics on your own. It was a horrible, horrible war in 3 years. I mean, just millions of people. And the arms race with the Soviet Union continues and is even escalates. Okay, guys, we'll stop there and pick up on the next episode.